In the closing days of 2024, the People's Republic of China did one of the few things that would win more attention from international analysts than showing off a new combat aircraft. They showed off too. We discussed both the larger aircraft, tentatively referred to as J-36, and that smaller Shenyang fighter last week. But that discussion still left at least one major question open. While China appears to be pushing ahead with next-generation aircraft development, what about the rest of the world? After all, when we first discussed the race for sixth-generation fighters back in 2022, we knew comparatively little about the Chinese efforts, while several Western programs appeared to be pressing forward. While now we've actually seen some Chinese airframes flying in real life rather than just CGI renders, many Western programs are being tested for expected survivability against high-end threats, like reviews, budget debates, and political wrangling. But with Beijing's demonstration now drawing attention back to the race to develop next-gen combat aircraft, today we're going to have a look at how the American, various European, and even Russian programs might compare in the future race for technical dominance in the sky. And since, of course, this is the second part of the interview we began last episode, I'll once again be welcoming back Professor Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology at the Royal United Services Institute. What we'll do in sequence is work through a number of international next-generation aircraft programs. That includes the US NGAD, multinational efforts like SCAF and GCAP, and finally, some stated Russian ambitions, starting with some relatively grounded stuff like wingman drones and a next-generation bomber, all the way up to some serious sci-fi stuff, like a hypersonic stealth fighter that's meant to be able to shoot down incoming missiles with a laser while operating close to space. Finally, we'll close out with some overall observations, including on the potential economic challenges of trying to operate these very expensive aircraft alongside teams of drones. I'll add the obvious caveat that a lot of these programs are still both A, in development, and B, heavily cloaked in secrecy. So while I'll be doing the best I can with what's publicly available, keep in mind that a lot of this sits squarely in the realm of speculation. And so now, before we jump into it, quick word from a sponsor. Previously, I've introduced you to Odoo, an all-in-one family of business software with 45 plus business applications covering a range of purposes. If, for example, you want to build a website quickly, easily, and efficiently, their website builder has you covered, and you previously saw me start work on a Perun website using Odoo. But what if you wanted your website to be a bit more web store and integrate some e-commerce functions? With Odoo's e-commerce builder, it's simple enough. We follow the same 4 steps, choosing a business type and objective, our color palette, pages and features, and then lastly, a theme. Then our online store is ready to be customized with drag and drop blocks, animation, text and font changes, images, and much more. Then we can quickly add our products, entering key information like the name and price, and then just like that, our product is created. It's then simple enough to customize the page by adding images, a description, or content blocks. Then with some products in place, you could set up an e-commerce function to help you get them sold. For example, you could enter your tax and banking details, establish an invoice design, set up your delivery options, and your payment providers. And just like that, you might be a long way towards your first sales. Odoo allows you to get started launching your e-commerce store for free with its lifetime free first app offer. That includes hosting and support, as well as a personalized domain name free for the first year. So if you're interested, please do check out today's sponsor Odoo. You'll find a link in the description. Okay, so we'll start with perhaps the most direct competitor to some of the Chinese projects we discussed last week, which is the American manned sixth-generation fighter at the heart of the next-generation air dominance program. If you want a bit more deep background on the NGAD program and what various US sources said they were trying to achieve with it, I'll link the episode on sixth-generation fighter development from back in late 2022. But for our purposes today, here are the spark notes. NGAD is often described in various sources as the successor to the F-22 Raptor. But critically, that doesn't actually mean the aircraft being designed for NGAD is likely to resemble the Raptor in any meaningful way beyond the US Air Force markings. Because as best as we can tell, the NGAD isn't meant to be a successor of the F-22 in terms of performance characteristics, it's meant to be a successor in terms of mission. Namely, give the US Air Force something that can realistically operate in contested or denied airspace, and then seal club its way to air superiority. When the Raptor was being designed, that meant combining features like stealth, supercruise, and agility. In the era of NGAD, though, the US Air Force's thoughts on what it takes to build an air dominance fighter have likely changed. Range and independence from enablers, for example, appears to have become much more important. Multiple US sources cite concern with the limited range of the Raptor in the context of potential Pacific operations, and by extension, its reliance on enablers like tankers. Given just how much threat Chinese platforms like J-20 or J-36 might pose to American tankers or AWACS aircraft when combined with PL-15 or PL-17 missiles, the thinking might go that it doesn't really matter if you build a super stealthy fighter, if your opponent just shoots down all the tankers and as a result it doesn't have the range to get to the combat area. NGAD then might want to be more independent from those enablers, meaning a lot more internal fuel, more powerful sensors, better power generation and cooling systems. Couple that with the stated desire for NGAD to be significantly stealthier than the aircraft that have come before it, then, as Justin describes, you likely come up with a recipe for a very large, very expensive UFO of an airplane, which I think segues well into this part of the interview. If we were to look at where SCAF or its various other names is versus Tempest, NGAD, FAX, and now what we've seen out of the PLAAF, and if we want the honourable mention for the Sukhoi 57, we can. What's the broad current status of these future air combat systems?
So the answer's quite different for each of the different programs you mentioned. So starting with NGAD, which is in some ways the one we know the least about, or at least I know the least about, we know a few things. Firstly, that an aircraft probably not dissimilar in size and range requirements to what we've seen the Chinese fly that people are calling J-36. Partly why people, I think, have jumped immediately to the assumption that this is the Chinese 6th gen NGAD fighter, because it's relatively similar to the sort of configuration we'd expect from and size that we'd expect from NGAD, based on the US requirement to have significantly greater organic combat radius than existing tactical fighters, longest range of which would be an F-15 Strike Eagle with 2 bags plus conformal fuel tanks, which would give you, depending on how you flew it, maybe somewhere in the region of 700 nautical mile combat radius. If you're looking at significantly more than that with everything internal, NGAD is going to be at least the size and weight of an F-111, so probably pushing with the aerodynamic inefficiencies that a broadband stealth profile forces you to make in some ways to fit everything in and still generate the lift and the performance that you want. You'd probably end up with something in the 50-55 ton takeoff weight region with a configuration not dissimilar to the J-36.
Now, obviously, moving up to that much larger airframe would give you a lot of freedom from an engineering perspective. More space equals more fuel, more effectors, more power, more cooling. And in terms of progress, while we haven't seen it publicly, it's generally reported the US Air Force probably flew a full-scale NGAD demonstrator some time ago at this point. But potentially going over to a much larger airframe that's as much stealthy AWACS and drone controller as it is a classical fighter would almost inevitably come with a massive trade-off cost, which in this case would probably just be cost.
By far the best way to predict operating cost, at the very least, of any aircraft is to look at max takeoff weight. It's essentially an operating cost curve. And then if you want stealth, you can shift that curve up dramatically. And if you want broadband stealth, you can shift it up even more. But still, the rule would stay similar, which is the heavier the thing is, broadly speaking, the more expensive it's going to be to operate and probably to buy. Anywhere around 150,000, maybe even more per hour, equivalent to fly something in the NGAD space.
Oh, and if you're wondering how much the things might actually cost to buy in the first place, spec is written. Justin's very rough estimate was somewhere between 300 and 350 million US dollars per tail, while former US Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall reportedly once flagged a price of around 300 million. Even in a country where seeing your hospital bill might be enough of an experience to send you right back there, that's some pretty steep pricing. And that's probably part of the reason why in 2024, even after multiple firms had reportedly developed NGAD demonstrators, the US Air Force reportedly went into deep review mode. They reportedly examined a range of options, including building an aircraft that was more of an F-35 follow-on than an F-22 successor, something in the 80 to 100 million US dollar price range rather than the multiple hundreds of millions that NGAD would likely cost, as well as other potential options like trying to use multiple platforms to achieve the NGAD's purpose rather than trying to fit all of that capability into a single aircraft. The US Air Force Vice Chief of Staff at the time reportedly said the following, quote, "You get two different answers if you frame the question as how do we achieve air superiority in a contested environment versus how do we build a 6th-generation manned platform. Those are not necessarily the same question." A CRS report went on to suggest that, quote, "Rather than building a newer, more advanced fighter jet, the Air Force may consider a different concept and disaggregating major subsystems such as the radar or weapons and moving those onto other platforms such as CCAs. The CCA being the collaborative combat aircraft or the loyal wingman style drone that NGAD is meant to operate alongside. And even if some of those potential solutions might represent second best options, if you like, in terms of giving the US Air Force the tools it needs to obtain air superiority over future opponents, the problem may simply be that the resources available for modernisation are so constrained that NGAD has a lot of competition on the priority list."
You can see why, given that the USAF has so many, and the US Air Power more generally, has so many competing essential modernisation programs right now, that NGAD is being re-examined very, very seriously. because while the capability has reportedly, even with the review process not being complete, there's been some kind of leaks that have suggested that the review has broadly come back and said, yes, we do think we need NGAD as scoped in terms of capability requirements. The issue, of course, is the USAF and the US fighter fleet as a whole is just aging out far, far faster than they can afford to, or even from an industrial point of view, can actually produce new aircraft, whether that be F-35, F-15EX, or something like NGAD. Plus, the tanker fleet is aging out vastly faster than KC-46 is being produced. Boeing's announcement for the end of the year, I was looking at the press release the other day, showed not a single KC-46 delivered in the last quarter, and I think about 10 delivered for the whole year. If you look across a USAF tanker fleet, which if you count Air Force Reserve plus Air National Guard, I think it's somewhere in the region of 470 KC-135s. And they're already trying to, the KC-46 was only really supposed to replace under contract initially the KC-10s. It's a vast tanker fleet that's mostly from the 50s, 1950s and 60s to a degree. So, they have to buy loads and loads and loads of tankers. They have to buy lots of tactical fighters. They have to reconstitute the ground-based ICBM
Sentinel
leg of the deterrent, which will be vastly expensive. They're having to reconstitute their ISTAR capabilities, probably with a greater focus on orbital. But you're seeing things like Joint Stars having gone now. You're seeing E3 age out, and they're buying E7s to at least partially replace that while they work on the kind of distributed orbitally reliant solution as well. It's just a huge amount of stuff to have to buy kind of yesterday. And this is the result of 15 years of deferred modernization while money was put towards the global war on terror. This is all of that coming back to bite, really. And so within that context, NGAD, even if you decide that you absolutely need it, at the sort of cost per tail, and of course we didn't even mention B-21, so at the sort of cost per tail that NGAD is inevitably going to cost, you can see why the US is looking at it very, very closely because of what it will do to their ability to meet any of their other budget necessities. We didn't even touch on weapon stock rebuilding and updating, nor the fact that they need to continue to modernize their existing fleets, whether that be everything from B-52 through F-16. And I think that's why the US is where it is on NGAD. It's not necessarily that the program itself or the aircraft design itself at the core of it doesn't meet the requirements anymore. It's that they're not sure that it's worth the money in the context of the opportunity cost.
So the question going forward is probably, will the United States find a way to put up the money necessary to build NGAD as currently scoped, or will budget and policy constraints end up pushing them down a different path? Back in January, Secretary Kendall indicated that China's decision to show off a large new stealthy airframe of its own didn't have an impact on how his team would approach the NGAD review, which probably makes a degree of sense if you assume the US was probably aware of J-36 before the public got to see it. But in terms of where the US decision on this topic is going, we have a couple of clues, but nothing definitive. For example, the US has recently announced a massive expansion in funding for the Next Generation Adaptive Propulsion Program. This was the next generation engine that was expected to power NGAD and was expected to deliver both very efficient cruise performance and very effective high-speed combat performance. Now, of course, that engine could be used for far more than just NGAD as currently scoped, but it's still billions of dollars being put on the table. Ultimately, though, as far as the public is aware, a decision remains to be made, with it now being up to the Trump administration to determine whether the US Air Force will get its large, expensive, penetrating superfighter, or if the US Air Force approach to future air superiority is about to make a massive pivot that could shape the way it operates and the international balance of power for decades to come. Now, there is one other complicating factor here, which is that the US doesn't just have a sixth-generation fighter program, it has two. As well as the Air Force NGAD, the Navy has FAXX, a carrier-based sixth-generation fighter broadly intended to replace the FA-18 Super Hornet. I won't go too far into that program today because it tends to be the star when we talk about navies rather than air forces. But for now, it's worth noting that while funding for the fighter has occasionally been under severe pressure due to the Navy's many pressing near-term demands, the indications, at least as of late last year, appear to be that A, the service is pushing ahead with the program, and that B, it's now mostly segregated from the US Air Force effort. In October 2024, for example, the US Chief of Naval Operations reportedly indicated that the Navy would soon be selecting between 3 competitors for the program, presumably Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman, and the intention still appeared to be that the aircraft would enter service sometime in the 2030s. Whether the program makes those target dates, however, will probably very much come down to budget. But the decision to keep the Navy fighter very separate from the Air Force One, unlike the approach with, say, the F-35, might well make it more likely that America fields at least one sixth-generation fighter in the 2030s, even if the budgetary axe comes for the other. And now the fact we've just talked about the US military having budgetary issues when it comes to sixth-generation fighter development is probably enough to clue you in on one of the great dilemmas that comes with these kind of advanced systems. On one hand, if you want your Air Force to be up to international standards, and potentially to still be competitive on the international arms market, you're probably going to want this kind of technology eventually. On the other hand, it's so bloody expensive that if you do want to develop it and then field it in economically viable quantities and don't happen to be the United States or People's Republic of China, your only real option, if you don't want to tax people into space or cancel your national health system, is to turn your sixth-generation fighter effort into a group project, which brings us to the first of 2 multinational projects we're going to discuss today, the so-called Global Combat Air Program and the Tempest sixth-generation fighter. When we first started talking about Tempest back in 2022, it was still realistically mostly 2 separate projects. The Tempest was going to be designed and built by a European consortium spearheaded by the United Kingdom and Italy. And the lineup of companies involved weren't exactly slouches. You had BAE Systems, Leonardo, Rolls-Royce providing the engines, and you had the UK arm of the European missile giant, MBDA, there to make sure the Tempest had some teeth. Then, on the other side of the world, the Japanese were pushing forward with the FX program, their own sixth-generation fighter. In terms of what we think we know about the Japanese requirements for FX, they were much closer to the British Tempest than, say, the American NGAD, a twin-engine fighter incorporating a range of next-generation technologies intended to replace the Mitsubishi F2. So probably more of a conventional fighter than the airborne cruiser you might see out of the NGAD requirement as written. Even back in 2022, though, it looked like the 2 programs were almost certainly going to merge. And as it happens, that's exactly how things played out. From a purely defence economics perspective, that merger into GCAP was something of a no-brainer. The intended development timelines were similar, the required performance appeared to align, there were opportunities for both sides to bring valuable technological and industrial know-how to the table, with many of those contractors we just mentioned having at least comparative advantage in several areas. Plus, everyone involved probably had at least some incentive to develop a program that was at least mostly independent from the United States, while a partnership would probably also just make the economics of an undertaking like this at least more bearable. Raw GDP is often a pretty flawed measure of the ability of a country to afford a major project, but if you look at this from that kind of zoomed out level, the United States, with a GDP of around $29 trillion is trying to run at least 3 sixth-generation programs, the NGAD fighter, the FAXX, and the B-21 bomber. In terms of sheer resource drain, you could probably also add an honourable mention for the Sentinel program, because none of the other countries we're talking about have to build a new ICBM fleet. That would give you a ratio of GDP to major next-generation aerospace program of about $7.25 trillion per program, or alternatively just under 10 to 1 if you don't count the missiles. If you look at just Japan, or the United Kingdom plus Italy, the ratios are much more painful. But bolt them all together and focus them on one sixth-generation program, and you get a GDP to major next-generation aerospace program ratio of, again, about 10.5 trillion to 1. Nearly 15 to 1, in fact, if you account for purchasing power parity. In other words, at least at this very zoomed-out level, by combining their efforts, these countries may not have been able to match the resources that America or China can divert into multiple different programs, but they could bring together the resources to make a peer-level investment in one program. Which means that, at least on paper, the GCAP program and the Tempest fighter can afford a little bit of competitive ambition. And one thing Justin suggested during our conversation is despite Japan and the United Kingdom being so geographically separated, the reasons why Italy, the United Kingdom, and Japan might have relatively aligned requirements for the next generation fighter may actually come down to the threat posed by a relatively similar technology base.
A view to, from a UK perspective, at a certain point, towards kind of the 2040 timeframe and beyond, F-35 is just not going to give you the penetrating capabilities that you need against the anticipated threat system development, particularly if the assessed risk comes to pass that Chinese systems start coming into the Russian inventory, at least by that timeframe, which seems pretty likely. Chinese sensors at this stage being a good deal superior to Russian ones in most ways. On the Japanese side, they need something to replace the Mitsubishi F2 and potentially also parts of their F-15 fleet, although that's primarily being replaced by F-35. And so there's a really serious operational requirement from them that starts a bit earlier than the UK. And for the Japanese, they're hard over on a 2035 initial operating capability to meet that Chinese threat growth that they're watching. And what that means is, particularly the Japanese requirement, and the fact that in Europe, countries like the UK that are looking at threat growth out to, even if it's Russia-centric, out to kind of the late 2030s, there is still an assumption that we have to plan on Chinese technology proliferating into Russian forces. And so, coupled with the fact that the Japanese requirement is there, ironically enough, GCAP or Tempest is actually being spec'd largely against Chinese pacing threat technologies rather than Russian, which is harder.
So essentially, all of the alliance partners here are working towards an aircraft with Chinese sensors, Chinese air defense systems, and potentially Chinese fighters in mind. That means a raft of new features: materials technology advancement, better energy generation and cooling, intelligent weapon systems, an advanced digital cockpit, one that, according to BAE, might enable a pilot to control the aircraft using gestures, while also projecting augmented and virtual reality displays directly in front of the pilot's eyes. It promises a, quote, next-generation radar that can provide 10,000 times more data than current systems, what current systems not specified, an integrated sensing and communication system, and the ability to operate alongside unmanned platforms. Although notably there's less emphasis in the public materials on extreme range or extreme stealth with Tempest than we see with the American NGAD program. And at least in 6th-generation fighter terms, the timelines to get this thing fielded are pretty aggressive. It's reported that manufacturing work has already started on the first prototype/demonstrator for Tempest, and the first flight should take place sometime in 2026 or 2027. That then gives the alliance partners about 8 years to refine the design, make any changes necessary, move to low-rate initial production, and get the thing operational by 2035. And while that's arguably a very aggressive timeline, it probably helps that the largest and wealthiest member of the coalition, Japan, very much considers itself to be on the clock. Around the world, you'll find lots of peoples that have complicated frenemy-style relationships. Historically, the Brits and the French, Melbourne and Sydney, and apparently now the US and Canada. But the Japan-PRC relationship doesn't really have that kind of complexity. They just really, really dislike each other, to the point where I saw one recent survey of people in China and Japan showing that about 90% of respondents had a negative view of the other country. Sure, that's just one survey, but it probably gives us a sense that this might not be the warmest relationship on the planet. That obviously puts the PLA, along with North Korea, at the forefront of Japan's defensive planning. And if you look at the technical matchup between the two in the air, things are somewhat variable. To match up against China's incoming J-35, the Japanese already have F-35 in service. And if you look at the 4th-generation fighters that both sides really rely on to make up a lot of their strength still, Japan's F-15s probably match up decently well against the likes of China's J-11. But things start to get a bit uglier for Japan if you ask how the likes of the F-2, which is basically a much enlarged and enhanced F-16, would do against the likes of China's J-20 or any of its incoming next-generation platforms. From a Japanese operational perspective, there's really a need to replace the aging F-2s with something significantly better relatively soon. And while the F-35 might be great from a capability perspective, especially after the Shinto Priest supply a buff or two, reports suggest that there have been some voices in Japan's defense sector that have been disappointed about how much involvement domestic industry has had in the F-35 program, which in turn might leave them pushing for another program where Japanese producers are a bit more active. And so with Japan now in the program, you can see another potential perceived sense of urgency and also an influence in the evolving concept design. Back in 2019, when this was largely a British-led program, this is the concept we saw for Tempest. While this, with an especially notable change to the wing design, is a concept we saw much more recently. That said, while we appear to have learnt a bit more about the aircraft, its intended performance characteristics, and deployment timelines over the last couple of years, there are absolutely still a couple of unknowns. For one, it's not entirely clear whether the GCAP alliance will end up expanding, with the biggest potential wildcard here being Saudi Arabia. In terms of future fighter procurement options, Riyadh finds itself in a complicated position. Their long-running policy has been to maintain qualitative superiority over the Iranians, who now look like they might be obtaining Russian Sukhoi 35s. That might then push the kingdom towards seeking 5th or 6th generation fighter options, but the primary supplier of 5th generation aircraft, the United States, has their own long-running policy of making sure that Israel maintains a qualitative superiority in the Middle East, which they currently do in part through the F-35. So even if the US was willing to eventually open up FAXX or NGAD to foreign export, they might not be willing to sell them to Saudi Arabia. unless they somehow first came up with something even shinier to sell to the Israelis. But while the Saudis may not have a lot of options, they do have a lot of money. Thus, the theoretical possibility of the Saudis joining GCAP and getting their hands on Tempest in exchange for putting up some serious oil dollars. As for whether that will ultimately end up happening, currently remains deeply uncertain. Italy has said that in principle they're in favour of the Saudis joining, but the jury is still very much out on Tokyo and London. For Japan in particular, which as a country is very cautious and reserved about exporting weapon systems or military technology, there may be more than a little reluctance to deal Riyadh in. If things did advance, it's also possible you might see Washington exerting some pressure in order to try and preserve the Israeli technological advantage, and also a traditional market for American exports. On the other hand, there might be those voices that would value Saudi money and Saudi orders boosting the program, as well as the prospect that if the Saudis aren't allowed into GCAP, they might partner up with someone else instead, with many of the potential alternatives not being particularly palatable from London or Rome's perspective. Another unknown at this point is that if the Tempest does take to the skies, what drones might be operating alongside it. Because while the requirement for Tempest to be able to team very effectively with unmanned systems is a long-running constant of the program, which unmanned systems is more of a question mark. BAE has shown off a concept for a loyal wingman-style drone, the ACP, or Autonomous Collaborative Platform, but at the same time, they're not the only ones, with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, for example, showing off two concepts in late 2024, one of which appears to be a larger, probably reusable, collaborative combat aircraft-style platform, about 10 metres long, while the other, much smaller one, at around 6 metres long, was more of a missile-drone hybrid. A likely disposable, probably single-use system, perhaps useful for ISR or air combat roles, hybridising between something like a MAL decoy, a cruise missile, and an air combat drone. And just to help complicate things even further, on the 23rd of October, the UK and Germany signed the so-called Trinity House Agreements on defence, which set the stage for potentially, among many, many other things, joint UK-German cooperation on combat drone development, which is particularly interesting because Germany isn't a part of the joint UK-Italian-Japanese program, but instead the European Franco-German-Spanish FCAS program. What remains to be seen is how these various concepts ultimately evolve, how these programs merge together, and what ultimately gets fielded alongside the Tempest fighter. And of course, that's only if Tempest does end up being fielded, which, as much sense as it might make from a military perspective, might still be up in the air politically. The UK's budget isn't in a fantastic shape, and the country's also in the middle of a strategic defence review, one where there are going to be a lot of competing priorities, including Tempest, jockeying for position. And as Justin noted, there's a possibility that the changing global environment and the new government in Washington creates pressure in the UK to focus more on short-term defence projects than those that are going to deliver fantastic capability in 2035.
Europeans are facing perhaps a more acute security threat, particularly within the current uncertainty of where the incoming Trump administration will take US security policy regarding European security, Ukraine and Russia. So, if you were to take the assumption of full-scale US military participation out of some sort of Russia-NATO clash, then the timeframes within which Russia could credibly pose a direct threat to NATO forces would accelerate dramatically. And so that increased political uncertainty and very, very starkly different tone from the incoming Trump administration compared to the Biden administration and previous US administrations is likely to drive a lot of European countries to focus more on immediate defense requirements. And therefore, those kind of long-range programs like GCAP or the French SCAF, French, German, Spanish SCAF, FCAS equivalent may kind of end up being pushed into the long grass a little bit just because of in-year spending constraints. But that's problematic particularly for GXAP Tempest because of that Japanese 2035 IOC requirement. It has to be ready. And so that's already a very demanding timeline. There isn't really space to push things right and still meet that, which is a key requirement from them.
So in that respect, Tempest might be up in the air politically. But I'd argue that at a big picture level, the decision to be made here for London, Rome and Tokyo is a lot more than what their next generation fighter will be and when they'll eventually field it. It's ultimately about whether those countries want to stay in the fighter game at all. In a lot of respects, scientific, engineering and industrial capacity is kind of like a muscle. If you don't use it, it atrophies incredibly quickly. Talented people exit to work elsewhere, which means they're not training up the next generation. No one invests in the latest generation capital, which is extremely expensive and specialised, because why would they if there are no orders coming for the next 15 years? And once that does fade away, it can become so expensive, difficult, and slow to build it all back up again that you can never really make a domestic program competitive with just importing another system from the United States. And those concerns very much came through from Justin when we turned to the industrial side of the Tempest question.
First and foremost, it's about maintaining the national capability of BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce and other bits of the UK defence aerospace ecosystem, Leonardo and others in Italy, and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and others in Japan, to stay in the combat aircraft game, essentially. If they
don't build it, you risk industrial atrophy.
It's not just risk. If they don't build it, that capability to develop and manufacture a full-scale combat aircraft will disappear. You have to keep doing that if you want to keep that as a national capability. And in many ways, it's already pretty late. A lot of people have already left that sector who had worked on previous gen programs.
And for me, that's probably what sets Tempest apart from the likes of NGAD or FAXX in the United States. Were the United States or People's Republic of China to delay or cancel one of their next generation programs, it wouldn't be fantastic for the defence sector, but there'd still be plenty of work to maintain that core capability. Even if Shenyang and Boeing might fall out of practice, their engineers might move over to Chengdu and Lockheed Martin. And that might provide a base of expertise they could potentially poach from in the future if they wanted to compete for future programs. But for Britain, Japan and Italy, Tempest is much closer to a kind of Avro Arrow moment, a top-tier Canadian Cold War era design that was eventually scrapped, with that decision sometimes being considered symbolic of the moment where Canada decided it didn't want to be in the business of designing and manufacturing top-tier military aircraft. At this point, it seems abundantly clear that both the United States and China are willing to put the money on the table to make sure their industry can design and field next-generation aircraft. Tempest is realistically probably the point where the UK, Italy and Japan get to decide whether they're willing to stay in that game or not. Moving on then, take a short trip from the UK across the Channel and you'll find yourself in the territory of another multinational sixth-generation program. In English, the program is referred to as the Future Combat Air System, or FCAS, but to avoid confusion with the UK FCAS program, because apparently acronyms are in very short supply and need to be reused in perhaps the most confusing way possible, going forward I'm instead going to use the French acronym SCAF. SCAF, like many of the other programs we've discussed, takes a system of systems approach, with the manned combat aircraft just being one component. The current primary program partners include France, Spain and Germany, with Belgium having joined as an observer state back in 2024. In terms of aircraft design, it seems likely, given its European origin, that SCAF is probably working towards something much closer to Tempest than the American NGAD concept. But in terms of likely timelines and the associated industrial strategy, the approach seems to be fairly different from the UK, Japanese, Italian effort, with the program apparently pushing towards an operational date for the aircraft in the 2040s rather than the mid-2030s.
France has very much taken a different view. They have looked at projected capability that they think they could produce within that sort of system of systems and next generation fighter ecosystem with the technology they think they'll be able to field in the mid-2030s, so 2035, 2040. And they've decided that doesn't meet French requirements, what they think is practically achievable. And therefore, they've pushed the entry to service goals for SCAF, FCAS, into the 2040s, so probably around 2045. And instead are doubling down essentially on a combination of a new F5 standard for Rafale, French fighter aircraft, and developing a companion series of UCAVs off the Franco-Swedish, and I believe possibly a few others, forgive me, other countries who participated, but Franco-Swedish-led Neuron UCAV demonstrator, which was developed back in the 2010s, I think, and flown. That being a fairly traditional kind of flying wing type, stealthy, at least designed to be stealthy UCAV with bays for weapons. So France's strategy for the 2030s is significant upgrades to the Rafale's sensor and data link and SATCOM and other connectivity elements, significant upgrades to the internal processing power to enable them to use more AI and machine learning kind of centric tools to improve pilot situational awareness and the ability to do things like interface with UCAVs while developing sort of companion UCAVs for Rafale initially, deriving from lessons and progress made with the Neuron program, all of which will hopefully feed into the FCAS SCAF thing in the kind of 2040s.
So one of the interesting points for me there is that SCAF may have actually decoupled the timelines for its various components. A lot of these overarching programs envisage advanced next-generation fighters operating alongside supporting drones. But what SCAF appears to be doing, compared to the likes of NGAD or Tempest, is pushing out the delivery date for the manned fighter component while planning to bring in the UCAV, the drones, much sooner. As Justin noted, Dassault has already flown a UCAV, the Neuron, which you can see pictured on screen on the right there. Plus, in another potential line of effort, you have the German agreement with the UK. And in both Berlin and Paris, you'll find quite senior voices talking about the urgent need to get these things fielded well ahead of the manned fighter. The CEO of Dassault, for example, reportedly said, quote, "This stealth combat drone will contribute to the technological and operational superiority of the French Air Force by 2033, end quote. While a Luftwaffe general is reportedly on record saying that the drone or remote carrier component of the SCAF program was needed much, much earlier than the 2040s. And in both cases, part of that imperative might be to stretch the capabilities of the aircraft those two forces already have just that bit longer in order to give the engineers just a bit more time to cook when it comes to the 6th generation fighter. For the French, that means keeping industry busy and the Air Force supplied by continuing to turn out newer and newer versions of Rafale. Even though the first deliveries of the upgraded F4 version only took place in 2023, the French are already talking about the F5, a version which may, among other things, set the jet up better to work alongside unmanned platforms. In other words, it looks like the French might be trying to stretch the capability of their 4th generation jets far enough that they can get away with skipping Gen 5 entirely, adding UCAVs to support the 4th gens in the 2030s, and then finally bringing the 6th gens into the mix in the 2040s. Meanwhile, in the short term, Berlin's in the process of adding the F-35 to their fleet. That'll give the Luftwaffe a stealthy fighter of its own that will hopefully help hold the line until the manned SCAF fighter begins to arrive in a couple of decades. As for which approach is ultimately the best one, it probably comes down to your perception of where the moment of greatest vulnerability is likely to be for any of these involved nations. Any really major, almost generational rearmament project like this tends to create what you might refer to as a valley of vulnerability. At some point along this decades-long curve between the decision to begin a program and the time you finally retire a system. If we were to split this into phases, when you first start development, your overall capability as a force might start to drop because you're pouring resources into research and development that hasn't actually delivered you a capability yet. Then you reach the initial fielding stage, where your technology is the newest relative to your opponent that it's ever going to be, but you only have the system available in relatively small numbers, which limits the overall impact that it might have. The first F-22s or F-35s entering service, for example, would have had a truly massive advantage over just about everything else in the air, but it's kind of hard to swing the results of an entire campaign using only a squadron or two of aircraft, no matter how fancy. The greatest payoff period then from an investment perspective is likely to be in the early maturity phase. This is when you've produced enough of your new system for it to be militarily useful and for you to achieve some economies of scale, but hopefully before enough time has passed to allow your opponent to come up with some truly effective countermeasures and adaptations. From there, once a fleet starts to get older and move towards its legacy and obsolescence and replacement phases, things tend to go downhill. All else being equal, your maintenance costs might start to go up as your airframes begin to age out and potentially the production line shuts down, while your opponent has potentially had plenty of time to try and figure out how they're going to deal with your system. If all you looked at was the delivery timeline for the manned fighter component, what you could basically argue is that while NGAD and Tempest are choosing to sacrifice a little bit of force capability in the 2020s for a significant payoff in the 2030s, Paris is choosing to maximise what they can do right now and in the short term with their existing Rafale fleet and maybe some new combat drones, in exchange for knowing they'll probably fall behind the curve in the late 2030s and early 2040s before the new fighter finally arrives. And that's of course only if the program and its budgets hold together and the fighter arrives as expected. Before we move on, I think there's one other question mark around SCAF that I think bears mentioning. For years, it's been theorised that the Franco-German-Spanish effort might end up merging with the UK-Italian-Japanese one. And we saw, for example, Italy's Air Force Chief of Staff commenting on that prospect back in 2021, with the logic in favour generally being that a single European next-generation fighter project would probably be much more affordable than two distinct ones. While that remains possible though, it's worth flagging there's more than a few barriers that process would need to cross. You'd need to square the requirements so that everyone involved agreed on what the fighter they were building should actually be capable of doing. You might have debates, for example, over whether the final aircraft should make the engineering concessions necessary to enable it to fly off aircraft carriers, something which might be very much valued by the French, who, unlike the UK, don't have a fifth-generation carrier fighter, but not be of particularly much interest to anyone else in the program. You'd have to take the process that's already been painstakingly gone through in both of these programs to divide work between various contractors and do it all again, but with more contractors involved. You'd now no longer just be splitting work between France, Germany and Spain, for example. You'd have to factor in Italy, the UK and Japan as well. There would almost certainly be debates over leadership, priorities, industrial participation, the budget and its sources. And even if you could square that particular series of circles, you'd still be left with a broad strategic disconnect between what would still be the economically largest and most populous member of the coalition, Japan, who very much want their fighter fielded by 2035, and most of the SCAF participants, who seem content to take a couple of extended lunch breaks and maybe get to it around the 2040s. My basic point here is that multinational programs can be hard, and amalgamating multinational programs even harder. So while it might make simple economic sense to build a single European 6th gen rather than two, for the moment the two programs do remain definitively separate, and work on SCAF's next generation fighter continues. For all this talk of multinational programs, however, there is still one country pushing forward mostly solo. Although how much that's a result of a desire for independence as opposed to just a lack of friends is ultimately up for debate. I am of course talking about the owners of one of the world's largest combat air fleets, the Russian Federation. We've spoken a lot in the past about the Russian Aerospace Forces, the VKS, and their publicly stated capabilities. In the lead up to February 2022, Russian state media was always keen to push this perception of Russia as possessing a world standard air force. But then again, Russian state media also claimed the air force had obtained air superiority over the entirety of Ukraine within the first week of operations. A claim which arguably aged about as well as an ice cream in the outback. But that hasn't stopped the Russians claiming further air force successes. And Russian media has generally been about as bullish on the future capabilities of the Russian Air Force as they have been on its recent claimed achievements. While there's a lot of scope to level criticisms at the modernisation plans for the VKS, you certainly can't accuse them of lacking ambition. Back in 2017, for example, it was reported that Russia's Industry and Trade Minister said the country was working towards a 6th-generation fighter, one, it was claimed, that might actually be hypersonic. The problem with Russia's ability to design and field next-generation aircraft, however, probably isn't ambition so much as pressing resource constraints. Even before the February 2022 invasion, the VKS inventory was arguably in a bit of a crisis. Aircraft almost across the board were aging out much faster than Russian industry could possibly replace them, leaving the country with a choice between significantly downsizing the air force or somehow finding the resources somewhere, potentially through foreign sales, to massively recapitalise the sector and dial up production. Now with the war in Ukraine both undermining Russian arms exports and the access of their industry to imported components, all while additional airframes are lost, either due to flying additional hours or being shot down by either the Ukrainians or the Russians themselves, one imagines that going forward there's going to be more and more competition in the Russian defence budget between the future modernisation requirements of the VKS and its immediate survival requirements. That is, what it takes to keep the airframes flying, fighting and armed in the here and now. And so with that pressure in mind, Justin and I walked through a number of Russian aircraft and drone development programs. Starting with two we've actually seen produced and even used in small numbers, the Sukhoi 57 and the Okhotnik drone. At this point, Sukhoi 57 has been in service with the Russian Air Force for a number of years. The initial contract was for the delivery of 76 fighters by 2027, and it's claimed that small numbers of the aircraft have been participating in the war in Ukraine, although based on the evidence available so far, that might mostly be in the standoff role, with Russia likely not being particularly keen to risk losing one of their premier platforms when they're still shopping it around for potential export deals. Although notably, that didn't stop the Russians losing one of these aircraft so far when it was struck on the ground by a Ukrainian drone. The question for Justin was what the short-term future for the program might be in the face of Western sanctions and also just the general demands of resourcing the war in Ukraine.
Su-57, I mean, look, they'll keep producing it at a relatively slow rate. They are struggling, we know, with availability of suitable avionics, particularly availability also of suitable composites, both for it and for the new bomber. Particularly some of the precursors are actually quite difficult to obtain and mix now with the sanctions. Over time, I think we'll see more and more Chinese substitution successfully pursued there, but it's certainly delaying things. And I don't think anything truly next gen is likely out of Russia in the immediate future. They've got their priorities elsewhere. And in any case, when you look at their air power requirements, it's primarily ground-based air defense to hold NATO air power back and rely mostly on ground-based firepower and long-range standoff missiles. So that tends to be where they put most of their efforts.
Russia's stated intention has always been for the Sukhoi 57 to operate alongside a loyal wingman-style combat drone. And in some respects, Russia was actually several milestones ahead some of its Western competitors in this area. They hadn't just come up with a design for a large flying wing UCAV, the Sukhoi 70 Okhotnik. They appear to have actually built a few and pushed them forward for combat testing. Given the potential of UCAVs to be a relatively cost-effective way to add mass and combat power to an air force, which might be something rather attractive to Russian planners going forward, I think the argument is very much there for the Russian Air Force to keep backing the program, even if resources are very much constrained. Although, as Justin pointed out, one recent test of the system against Ukraine appears to have gone so horribly wrong that it's hard to imagine how it could have gone worse without the system going entirely rogue and kamikazing into Putin's holiday house or something.
In terms of their Su-70 or Okhotnik B, their UCAV, continued airframe development, sure. It's actually not as technically difficult in some ways as certainly truly next generation fighters, for example. They were clearly testing it in at least combat proximity, and then had something go wrong and had to shoot it down quite recently, which was interesting. I won't lie and say it's also highly amusing. But clearly they were doing some interesting combat testing there, and something went wrong. And they waited till the last possible minute, and in fact slightly beyond the last possible minute, to shoot it down, hoping they could get back control. And then it fell in Ukrainian territory and was promptly photographed, analysed slightly, and then blown up in a subsequent Russian strike.
So, yeah, they lost control, had to shoot it down, stuffed that process up so it landed partially intact in Ukrainian territory and was able to be partially documented before they were able to hit it with another airstrike. That said, there's unfortunately nothing particularly unusual about new weapon systems finding interesting ways to screw up the moment they get to the combat zone. And so as long as the Russians think they can continue to refine the design to remove undesired behaviours, like offering free delivery of state technical secrets directly into enemy hands, we can probably expect them to continue to do so. Where things probably start to get increasingly dicey from a Russian perspective, however, is those programs that haven't actually flown yet. Because that's where you start to talk about a lot of resource demand and technical risk for a program that might not deliver any actual combat power for years to come. Although here just how much danger a program might be in depended very much on what it was, with perhaps the least endangered being Russia's planned next-generation strategic bomber, the PACDAR. This was meant to mark a major turning point in Russian bomber design, from Russia's supersonic variable geometry aircraft like the Backfire and the Blackjack, towards a likely subsonic design that relied more on stealthy characteristics for survivability. From the point of view of the Russian bomber force, though, perhaps even more significant than those stealthy features was the fact the PACDAR bomber was going to be a bomber, which matters given just how old a lot of the Russian bomber fleet has gotten. The US is currently struggling to maintain a bomber force that only includes one of the maintenance-intensive variable geometry designs, the B-1 Lancer. Russia is currently flying two separate designs, many of which are several decades old at this point.
Yes, I would be very, very pessimistic about Russian capacity to seriously develop. Certainly any of the reported next-generation programs or existing next-generation programs beyond what they've already flown. So, the highest priority of those kind of still largely paper projects would definitely be the next-gen bomber, the PACDAR for the Russians. They place a huge amount of emphasis on their long-range aviation. And, while they are reproducing brought back into production Tu-160 and are modernizing their existing ones slowly to the new standard, they know they can't run on, for example, Tu-95 forever. And Tu-22 M3 even. So there will need to be bomber upgrades at some point. So that's where I think you'd expect to see the highest priority given to the programs we haven't seen fly yet.
But before we get on to those aircraft that haven't flown yet, two quick addenda on the bombers. The first is to say that while it might be unlikely that Russia decides to rely on the turboprop-powered Tupolev 95 forever, I'd be deeply cautious about writing the ancient bears off just yet. The Bear is basically Russia's contemporary to the American B-52, and those American bomb trucks have decent odds of making it to Centurion status. A lot of it will likely just come down to how much money the Russians are willing to invest in keeping those old airframes flying. The second point is that even if PACDAR is considered the highest priority of Russia's not yet flying programs, that doesn't mean it hasn't already been horribly delayed. What you can see on the right there is a Russian report from May 2020, citing the Deputy Minister of Defense saying the aircraft's engines would be undergoing testing that year, and another source reporting that the construction of the first PACDAR would be fully assembled in 2021. Come 2021, TASS was now reporting that the PACDAR demonstration model would be ready by 2023. And now that we're in 2025, we've actually hit the start of the window where TASS previously claimed back in 2019 the aircraft would actually be entering service. It stated, quote, "The deliveries of the long-range strategic bomber PACDAR to Russia's aerospace force are expected to begin in 2025 to 2030 after trials." While it also quoted then Deputy Defense Minister Yuri Borisov saying the new strategic bomber would likely take to the skies in 2025 to 2026 and go into series production in 2028 or 2029. Now, I'm just saying that if Russia did happen to have a stealthy strategic bomber that was survivable against opposing air defences that could potentially be used to deliver precision strikes against valuable targets, that might be kind of useful against an opponent with an intact air defence system, like Ukraine. But while we obviously can't be certain, I suspect that some combination of sanctions, wartime demands, the shifting of resources towards the restarting of Tupolev 160 production, and just the general challenges of getting a stealth bomber fielded when you're a country that hasn't built a stealth bomber before, have pushed the PACDAR well and truly off the list of Russian aircraft we expect to be produced in any kind of significant numbers between now and the end of the decade. That said, it still probably puts the PACDAR on a considerably better footing than Russia's other fifth-generation fighter project. This is the Sukhoi 75 Checkmate, supposedly intended to be a more affordable single-engine stealth fighter primarily for export customers, which has so far struggled to actually attract export customers for all of the reasons we've discussed that generally afflict Russian exports in the past, plus the fact that, as far as we can tell, the airplane doesn't really exist yet, or rather doesn't exist as a finalised operational aircraft. And what Russia might essentially be doing is hoping that a foreign buyer comes along to essentially bankroll some of the development and the production effort for the product they're trying to buy. Justin's assessment of the Checkmate's likely future was relatively succinct.
I think Su-75, the Checkmate, I suspect that's just a paper plane, and that's all it'll ever be, just because of the dearth of funding available to higher priority projects, and let alone something that's clearly very early on in kind of concept and technical development.
But that assessment's probably resoundingly optimistic compared to what could be said about Russia's sixth-generation fighter program. Because while yes, Russia still appears to be struggling with some of the features we associate with fifth-generation fighters, or duplicating the American stealth technology we saw deployed on bombers in the 1990s, that doesn't mean that, at least publicly, Russia isn't keen to push ahead to join the others in the sixth-generation race, or even potentially leap ahead and go even further. With the commander of Russia's aerospace forces being quoted in Russian state media, saying the country was working on a sixth-generation fighter, that it was being developed in both manned and unmanned versions, and that, quote, "Therefore the work is going on the sixth and perhaps the seventh generation fighters." There are a few concepts or names that have been associated with Russia's sixth-generation fighter efforts, one of which is the PAC-DP, sometimes referred to as MiG-41 by analysts, although it wouldn't have that designation officially. And on this one, Justin's assessment was even briefer.
MiG-31 replacement, the sort of supposedly spaceplane mini-capable, hyper-stealthy, hypersonic thing, forget about it.
Yeah, no, Justin, I don't think we will. Because next-gen system development videos often benefit from a good sci-fi section. And in that respect, some of the things the Russians have said about their sixth-generation fighters absolutely deliver. If you search the words MiG-41 and check out the AI search results, you might be forgiven for thinking you're dealing with a case of AI hallucination. It'll tell you that MiG-41 is a sixth-generation fighter being developed by Russia, intended to be a stealthy, high-altitude, hypersonic aircraft capable of flying between 4 and 5 times the speed of sound, that it will be equipped with a cutting-edge anti-missile laser, and yet the design was finalised in 2019 and it was due to fly for the first time in 2025. And if you're wondering what piece of dodgy internet fan fiction the AI might be hooking onto to make claims like that, yeah, how about articles claiming to cite a Russia Today interview with the General Director of MiG back in 2017? To quote one such article, the MiG-41 is to reach the speed of Mach 4 to 4.3 and be armed with a laser to shoot down enemy missiles. According to Ilya Tarasenko, the General Director at MiG, if the buyer decides to buy the aircraft, the serial MiG-41s may be available as early as 2025. Oh, it also claimed the aircraft would be capable of operating, quote, in the Arctic and outer space, end quote. So I guess the Ukrainians better watch the skies while the Americans hurry up with the F-302 program, because apparently the hypersonic Russian space fighters are well and truly on the way. And just in case you're wondering, TASS also carried articles explicitly referring to the aircraft as MiG-41 and quoting Tarasenko as saying the following, Quote, "This is not a mythical project. This is a long-standing project for the MiG, and now we are carrying out intensive work under the aegis of the United Aircraft Corporation, and will present it to the public soon." End quote. The article also noted that deliveries of the aircraft to the Russian Armed Forces were expected to start in the mid-2020s. That is, of course, unless the Russian contract for a 6th-generation MiG-31 replacement goes to a Sukhoi design rather than a MiG. Russia Today recently posted this over on Twitter, saying that Russia was advancing its 6th-generation fighter development, with a quote from the head of the Sukhoi Design Bureau. As for the concept itself, I'm a big fan of the third engine that apparently doesn't need an intake, and the little Grok watermark in the bottom right. For his part, Rostec director Anatoly Serdyukov appears to have suggested that Russia might develop a 6th-generation fighter as a combined MiG-Sukhoi project. He was quoted saying as much back in 2020, but also indicated that work at the time was still very much in the discussion phase. But for me at least, getting too lost in the potential corporate structure of a Russian 6th-gen project or the particular technical features it might offer, I even saw some claims that the MiG-41 would possess an electromagnetic cannon, for example, really kind of misses the point in the current Russian context. Discussing what technical features Russia might want in a near-future 6th-generation fighter doesn't matter much, when they're probably about as likely to be able to actually field the things in the near term as I am to become president of North Korea. In the here and now, the FCAS probably just has more immediate pressing concerns than trying to dump money into fielding a bloody A-wing. Several parts of the fleet, from the MiG-31s to some of the strategic bombers, are in desperate need of recapitalisation. Their long-range aviation appears to have an almost insatiable demand for long-range missiles to fling at Ukraine, and of course there are the aircraft and pilots that are actually being lost in Ukraine that Russia is probably going to want to replace. At the moment, those things, as well as enhancements like protective aircraft shelters to stop Russian aircraft being destroyed on the ground by Ukrainian drones, probably fall more into the FCAS need column, while the Flash Gordon shit is probably about as far as it is possible to be over into the wants column. I'm always deeply cautious about writing off the capabilities of Russian scientists or Russian engineers. But the reality is some of these requirements would be a big ask even for the likes of the United States or People's Republic of China. And even if somehow the resources were found and allocated and products designed, tested and fielded, I think the biggest question at the end, besides how, would still be why. Because if in a world where Russian troops in Ukraine have often had to rely on volunteers or purchase their own equipment and use adapted vehicles and golf carts in assault work, Russia decided that no, that's all well and good, but what we really need is a hypersonic near-space interceptor. It wouldn't just be a militarily nonsensical decision, it would be the very definition of all bling and no basics. So, on reflection, I guess the chance of that happening probably isn't actually zero. That brings us to the end of the list of programs I wanted to go through today, but because it is me, I couldn't resist tacking one additional defense economics point on the end here. And it has to do with one of the common features we've seen across almost all of these next-generation fighter programs. Whether you are talking about China, the United States, Russia, or the various joint programs, one common feature appears to be that just about everyone expects these next-generation manned fighters to be very, very expensive, and a big part of the plan on how to make them effective, how to maintain mass and a large air force despite the costs involved, is to rely on manned-unmanned teaming, combining those expensive manned platforms with more affordable drones. Intuitively, that makes a huge degree of sense, leveraging advances in things like networking at the same time as giving air forces a better solution to very high-risk environments. Beyond the technical problem of getting that system of systems approach to work, however, there's also an investment and budgeting problem. And it comes down to the dual trade-offs of how capable and survivable do you choose to make your drones at the expense of making them more expensive and less disposable. And secondly, how do you prioritize your resources, both financial and industrial, between building up your manned and unmanned component? Because for every dollar you divert from building fighters to building the supporting drones, you're taking away some of the economies of scale you might be experiencing in the fighter program, and vice versa. And when Justin and I turned to that topic, he had a couple of opinions about the difficulty in getting that balance of investment right.
The issue for a lot of these things, though, is the cost benefit is actually relatively difficult to make. To find a sweet spot on, because to develop a usable kind of a practical kind of system of systems with, your uncrewed loyal wingman type UCAVs as your leading edge for your stealth crewed platforms, which are themselves the kind of leading edge for your more traditional non-stealth platforms, you not only need to make something that is hypothetically useful or even practically useful in terms of those uncrewed systems. You need to make something which, in its totality, so not just the airframes, but all of the people required to operate them, service them, that's a significant ecosystem with a lot of people involved and a significant cost factor. So there's all these kind of things that once you start going into practical employment concepts of any given configuration, you run into a lot of stuff that increases costs pretty quickly in totality. And therefore, the test is it in its totality, your new uncrewed system, which everybody is convinced is kind of the future of building mass back into combat air, is it actually a greater increase in combat capability than spending the same amount of additional money on just buying more of the quote unquote exquisite platforms and munitions that we think of as unaffordable in mass? But that's partly, and not in the case of the US really, but for a lot of countries, that's partly because we've been looking at how to try and pivot back to being able to do state-on-state warfare for deterrence purposes without massively changing budgets from a peace dividend counterinsurgency point of view, and without massively cutting force structure elements that are optimized for that counterinsurgency permissive piece. In some ways, the answer may actually be just, for some problems at least, just buy more of the munitions you already have, including things like high-end decoys like Mold-X, which actually functionally do a lot of the things that people ascribe to loyal wingmen or UCAV type things, i.e. they are jet-powered, carried by existing combat aircraft, released to go in ahead of the main group and do high-end electronic warfare and spoofing. It's just that we don't call them UCAVs, we call them decoys, and so people don't think of them that way. One of the reasons we don't have enough is because they're reasonably expensive, but compared to some UCAV concepts, they're actually probably quite cheap. And if you want them to be at the high end, reusable, survivable, at least relatively survivable, even if you could afford to lose them more than you can afford to lose crewed platforms, then that sensor and missile threat picture is such that you need to go fairly high end quite quickly to get that survivability bit of reusable. So it needs to be pretty stealthy, and therefore it needs to have very sophisticated sensors and cooling systems and power generation within us to be able to do all the things that it will need to do within a stealthy, clean airframe. And if you want it to be lethal, it also has to have space for internal weapons, plus all the fuel for out and back, the same distances as your combat aircraft are doing. You quite quickly get into the sort of price tag that the CCA program is now talking about in the States. So the Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, or which are called ACPs for some reason in the UK, so Autonomous Collaborative Platforms. But the CCA program now talking about maybe a third of the cost of an F-35. So around $20 to $30 million, depending on how you interpret the cost of an F-35.
And so in closing, I think that encapsulates one of the great challenges faced by countries wanting to compete for technical superiority in the air going forward. Development programs for aircraft, weapons, and drones are now so long and so expensive that if you make the wrong call on the system that you design and field, or the mix between them, you're going to be dealing with the consequences for many years to come. And in terms of decisions to be made, it's not just about picking the right aircraft concept, whether that be more like the American NGAD or something like Tempest. It's also about picking the right vision for what your force mix in the 2030s or 2040s might look like, what capabilities it's going to need, and where you choose to invest your dollars and effort today, so you end up with the best possible combination when it really matters. As for which country ultimately turns out to be closest to a winning bet, only time will tell. But just for fun, as a purely subjective assessment, I did put the question to Justin. Assuming none of these programs are cancelled and proceed as intended, what sixth-generation fighter and associated missiles would he choose if it had to go up against a peer adversary in 2035?
If it's 2035, assuming all of the current programs mooted or in contention technically work out, as do the missiles, which one would I take? If I was going into combat, I mean, sorry to be cliche, but it would still be NGAD with whatever the Americans have armed it with. Not just because of the level of expertise and experience that they have in really practical, low observable combat aircraft, but also because the way that American systems that I've ever interacted with relative to other nations' systems manage the sensor to weapon to kind of pilot interface integration and maturation is just so much better than most of their rivals in most contexts, because they put so much more funding into it on such a greater, more sustained basis. So that comes with its own costs, and for non-American customers, maybe limitations, sovereignty limitations, ITAR restrictions, all of those other things. But if you were just asking what would I rate my chances highest in aircraft for aircraft going into a high-end combat situation in 2035, assuming everything works, NGAD plus presumably AIM-260 and whatever else the Americans arm it with.
And okay, very brief channel update to close out, as I'm still very much under the weather. This episode is basically the second half of the interview I did with Justin. The first part was released the other week and focused on Chinese next-generation developments. And while I was originally intending to release this a little later in February, I ultimately made the decision to bring it forward somewhat, just because, as I said, I've been fairly unwell, and there was less work still to do on this episode than the one I originally intended to release. That said, I hope to be feeling better in the new week and back on a regular release schedule, which means getting back to not just Ukraine, but also a couple of topics that have been voted for by the patrons. Until then, though, I very much hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you very much to Justin, obviously, for his time, and thank you as always for your patience and support, especially when I'm under the weather. I wish each and all of you the very best, and hope to see you all again next week.